Hi, and welcome to another episode of Talking About Teaching Economics. My guest making a second appearance in the podcast today is Eric Kam from Toronto Metropolitan University. And today we're going to talk about elasticity. And I'll preface this by saying this is one of those topics that just about every student struggles with. And I know a lot of instructors really don't like teaching. So we'll get right into it. Eric, when do you cover this topic in your standard intro micro courses?
You know, it's funny you say that because I actually love teaching it, but you're absolutely right. The fear is something. So I always get to elasticity, probably not surprisingly, right after supply and demand, and of course, before taxation, because you want to do elasticity before taxes so that when you get to taxes, you can do the who pays the incidence. So it always comes in time-wise, it's always right after reading week. I like to pace myself, as we've discussed. I don't rush opportunity cost. I don't rush comparative advantage. So I can usually get to supply and demand completely thoroughly, then have a midterm, then have reading week, then get to elasticity. So basically first week back from reading week, I jump right in.
So this would be about chapter 4. And as you said, that was going to be my other question was, do you do it before or after the excise tax piece? So about chapter 4, and they don't have a lot of other pieces in play yet. So basic question, do you do arc or point?
Oh, I do. Well, actually, I do both.
Oh,
But I do point when it comes to their exams. And
right.
listen, it's enough for these students. When I think two things make teaching elasticity really difficult. And one we can control and one we can't. One is as soon as they see the formula for price elasticity of demand, you can almost hear the heart attack in the room because it looks to a first year student like it's really confusing. It's got lots of variables and this and that. And you have to talk them down off the ledge and say, okay, let's really break this thing down. And if you do, well, there's really not much to it.
No.
I mean, they know what a difference is and they know what an average is. And I'd like to think they can divide difference by average. They just have to do it twice. So number one, I think it's just that it's that seeing it. It's seeing this. Here's the formula. And I think there's a bit of a, they call it sticker shock when you walk into a store. Yeah. But I also think, and this is true, at least in my experience, there's a bit of hysteresis going on. All of their friends in second year tell them, just wait till elasticity. And so they're kind of already like with the knuckles like this going, please God, let's not do elasticity today. But you got to do it eventually. And so I think a lot of them are kind of, they're almost setting themselves up to have a difficult time with it because you can see the sweat on their faces when the word even gets mentioned. Yet, we'll dive into this, but by the end of it, I think it might be the most fun topic and most interesting topic to teach in first year.
So that brings up my next question. How do you motivate it? Particularly if you're doing it before, say, demand and you thought, or before taxation, like how do you motivate this, fairly scary looking formula?
First, I tell them that this is probably the most interesting topic we're going to do and something that has lifetime applicability. That's number one. So I hope to kind of whet their appetite that way because I tell them that economics grows on itself and, and you scaffold and this and that, whatever.
Very vertical structure.
Right. And I tell them, okay, now you know supply and demand. You're experts in supply and demand. I know you're experts because I taught you, and that's as good as it gets. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to remember 3 simple words. And they all go, what words? And I go, by how much? And they go, what do you mean by how much? And the first person I look at, I go, give me the law of demand and get it right because 900 people are listening. And they go, price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And I go, excellent. By how much? And they go, what do you mean by how much? I go, this is the thing. You know that if price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. But I want to know by how much? And if those 2 things are going on, so you know that if one's going up, one's going down, I want to know which one's going up and which one's going down more. So is the quantity demanded moving more than the price? Is the price moving more than the quantity demanded? Maybe they're equal. Or maybe in a rare case, when the price goes up, quantity
Nothing.
demanded doesn't move at all. So I need to know by how much. I mean, I'm glad that you know, it's like I'm getting into lecture mode. I'm glad you know that if one goes up, one goes down. But I need to know that when the one goes up, how much does the other one go down? And that's how I started. And so before I even go into, because really the question is, of course, if you have an increase in the percentage change in price, then you have a decrease in the percentage change. But before we even get there, I just try to get them. I know you know the directions now. I know you know that if this goes up, this has to go down. But I want to talk about by how much does this go up? And then by how much does this go down? And that tends to at least clue them into, okay, I know this much, but he's saying now we're going to like take it another level.
Right.
That's how I motivate it.
No, it's a great stack on demand. And it's one of those, where to put it in the course has been one of those things I've flopped around on and tried in a couple of different places. So from that setup, how do you move them off the answer to by how much of slope?
Oh, well, that's a nice slide. And I think that most of the really good Pearson books always have a slide or a sentence that at least says elasticity is not slope. But you know what? 23 years running now, thankfully, and it's not a plant, although I would consider doing that. It's not a plant, but someone puts up their hand and says, isn't this the slope? Isn't this just moving down the demand curve? And I always say, thank heaven. And I say, the answer is no. But if you're going to step in it, really step in it. So not only is it no, but it's a resounding no. And that leads me into why is it no? And we go into what is the formula for the slope? What is the formula for elasticity? And I say simply, when you move down a linear demand curve, how does the slope change? And somebody says it doesn't. And I go, but it does when it's elasticity, because rise over the run is not the ratio of two differences over percentage changes. And then when they see the formulas side by side, then they really get it, or at least they get, hold it a minute, these are two really different things. I think I understand this one because I kind of get slope. I don't think I understand this one because that looks a whole lot more convoluted than slope. And so that's how we even, but we don't even get there for a little bit. I want to make sure that they're confident with, first of all, the formula. We deconstruct it. We take out the terror. We make sure that they multiply by -1. And we talk about, because the thing has to be it has to be a negative number because it's a negative relationship. It's not till almost the end of price elasticity of demand that I do that funky total revenue thing where we show the relationship between elasticity and total revenue and how it changes along a demand curve. And I almost feel like I owe you a better than just like that 3 seconds I just said, that revenue and elasticity thing, because I take up about a half a lecture doing it because I think it's important. And I asked this question to motivate that. Why do things go on sale? Why do we do sales? Why does the store ever have a sale? And that's how once I'm confident or comfortable that they understand now a little bit about what elasticity is, how does it relate to total revenue? Which I think might be the single most difficult topic of the semester. So I make sure that I don't rush. And price elasticity of demand, I take as much time doing that as I do all the other elasticities. Because I think if they get price elasticity of demand, the other ones kind of fall into place.
Yeah, well, they see a pattern, and so one of the things I do is I'll ask this question, and I'll talk a little bit about what I do with it. So, how many other elasticities do you typically cover?
Price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand.
Because I do the same batch, and one of the things I do at the end is I show them the pattern. I say, now we can make up our own. So I just have them make up their own elasticity and tell me what it means. So this is one of those great 95% questions on a midterm. It's like, okay, you've done all this other stuff. I want to see you do something. Right.
Yeah. And my favorite midterm question, this is my favorite, and I admit I steal it from Abby Cohen, is I will have when I could do written questions, I would have prices and quantities demanded. and I would have them work out the elasticity, and then I would change the price, ask them what happens to total revenue, and then I'd always have a final question. Did you need to completely work out all you had to work out to answer my question? And the good students get no. As soon as I found out that it was elastic or inelastic, I knew what total revenue was going to do. And I love that because that means they really do get it.
No, they put all the pieces together in a neat little bundle. Actually, that brings up. So you're. It sounds like your approach to it is relatively calculation heavy, which I share. But one of the things I've been playing with on and off over the last several years is trying to teach them to avoid cowboy math. Because I've run into this in talking to people in public health when doing work on cannabis. They think they can calculate elasticity just from prices and quantities. And in policy work, oh yeah, the demand for whatever's inelastic or it's elastic, it's like, no. Right. So I use that as a springboard. So what other how much stress do you put on the assumptions that underpin that calculation?
As much as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Like everyone, we only have 12 weeks, and I can't spend 12 weeks on elasticity. Although, boy, sometimes you're tempted to spend more than 2 or 3 because you could. So what I try to do in a sense is once I think that they're kind of getting it, is I guess I do what you do. I bring in some real life prices and quantities demanded. First, I invent them, but then I actually bring in some. And I bring in some of like the Toronto Real Estate Board, and I bring in prices and quantities demanded. And we work out and we see what the housing market looks like. And I will do things like that. And the other thing that I like to do is, if it sounds like I do it math heavy, I guess I do, guilty, but I always make sure that those numbers are right beside the curve. I want them to see an inelastic demand curve is steep. Do you know why it's steep? Because look at this huge price change and this little quantity demand change. And so I'm able to kind of say, like, if you understand the math, great. I'd like you to understand the picture because they're really the same thing. And you really know you're off to the races when you understand them both.
Okay.
And we talk a lot about that. I mean, I use the age-old examples of, insulin for the things that are inelastic and cruises. But what I really like to do where you can is just bring in real world data. And it's not hard to find real estate data, data on car sales, data on the potato marketing board and see what happens with potatoes and prices. It's not hard to root it into the real world, but that's really later for me. Is I first want to debunk it, teach the nuts and bolts of the formula, teach the nuts and bolts of the curve, teach the nuts and bolts of the total revenue argument, and then go off and have fun with the other elasticities. And maybe one of your questions is going to be, which one do they like? They like income elasticity. They think it's fascinating to see whether a good is normal or inferior. And they also like to see again in that, what does a big change in your income do? How can a big change in income cause this little change in your demand for a good? And I say, because it's possible. Because it's possible, because nobody has the same income elasticity of demand. Everybody's is different for all goods. And so we try to go into the heterogeneity of it.
Oh, okay. Neat. No, that's a good point. I mean, I usually teach this around syntaxes. So, and again, does it work or doesn't it work? And that's one of the reasons why I get into it. So you talked about the revenue, the total revenue point. That was going to be one of my next questions. So what is the ultimate goal? Like, what is it? You said you spent a couple of weeks on this. What's the ultimate? Yeah, they got it. I know they got it. I'm happy with it. What's the message? The bullet point of that 2 weeks.
The bullet point is, to go back to my original statement, is I want the students to understand that in economics, something has to give. I always make a joke and they laugh, but I'm not kidding. There's 2 things I'm sure of now after studying economics. Number one, something's got to give. You disturb something, something else has to give. And then I call it the example of the male anatomy. What goes up must come down, and then it goes back up again. And so what I want them to do is going back to the first one, something's got to give, is if I disturb the price
Hmm.
In economics, something's got to give. And something has to give, whether it's the quantity demanded of the own good, the quantity demanded of another good. I
Hmm.
want you to understand that economics is dynamic, that things are forever changing. And yeah, we use comparative statics, but when you disturb that price, the first thing I want you to think about is, did you disturb it a lot or a little bit?
Hmm.
And was the causal relationship big or small? And then I tell them something like, economic size does matter. But that's really where I'm going, is that
Hmm.
I've tried, it's like, it's your scaffolding. I've tried to teach them when they do the law of demand, that there's an inverse relationship. That's great. But now I want you to, let's really get in and understand almost a post-mortem on that inverse relationship, right? It's not enough for you to sit there and say, one goes up, one goes down. I want to know, how much did one go up and how much did one go down, and who cares? And
Right.
that's how I get into taxes. By going,
Oh,
who cares? You care. And taxes, again, is very long-winded for me, because I probably draw that graph 15 times of
oh
this.
yeah.
You put the tax on, the supply curve goes to the left, and then you have your original price, your old equilibrium, and then and we do, and it is rote. I do it over and over and over again. New price, old price. How much does the consumer pay? How much does the producer pay? And then we do it again, and then we do it
Hmm.
again, and then we do it again, because they're always blown away the first time. But the taxation example for me asks the who cares. That's who cares.
Right.
You care.
Right.
You care unless you enjoy paying taxes.
No, and that's great. Yeah, I think it's really neat that you've basically flipped my progression, which is really interesting, and something I'm discovering from more and more people I'm talking to, that there's a lot of people, like there's a buildup that goes one way, but there's a lot of people doing it in the exact opposite direction, which I think is really neat. Um, no, I think that's, yeah, that who cares, and getting to that next step is
Right,
really,
because we're trying
really
to
important.
create economically literate people here.
Hmm.
One day might walk into a store or a ballot box and have to make good decisions. And so, I don't have to keep telling them over and over again, but I sort of do that. It doesn't get more real world than this. Some of you are, worried about, how does this relate to the real world? Well, how does it get more real world than the price of your insulin going up by 300%?
Yeah. So you can talk about, it's a little dated now, but the farmer bro, who, I forget which company he bought, but yeah, and immediately cranked up the price of one of the drugs,
Oh, remember that?
300%.
Yeah, they went up
Yeah.
like 3,000% or something.
Yeah, overnight. It's just like, because I can.
Right. And so that's the who cares. That's
Yeah.
the who cares angle that I carry into taxes, because I think taxes confuse them, maybe not as much as elasticity, but that graph freaks them out the first time that they do it, when they shift
Mhm.
the supply curve and they find they have three prices. And that's why I do it on the board, and I put TC, that's the tax the consumer pays, and TP is the tax the producer pays, and I blow it up big so they can see one's really big and one's really small,
Right.
because of elasticity. What determines
Mhm.
that big and small is the elasticity. That's it. That's all. And then the last thing I do, because by then I'm sick of it, is I do the elasticity graph one more time, four ways: perfectly elastic demand,
Mhm.
perfectly inelastic demand, perfectly elastic supply, perfectly inelastic supply, and go, now we're done.
Right.
Now you know the spectrum.
You see, we've covered the entire territory.
There's nothing left.
Yeah. Well, it brings up we've kind of wandered off into taxes, but I think this is useful, and it brings up something that I've seen others do, and I've been guilty of it at times myself. Is we tend to want to teach it with curves with the same slope.
Yes, we do. And I'm guilty of it in a
Yeah.
sense to start with, because I think you have to start somewhere. And so, of
Hmm.
course, I do start with making the magnitudes of the shift equal. But I get away from that. What I don't get away from, of course, is I do keep all of my curves linear,
Hmm. Yeah. It
um,
just.
be- because I don't need to really put them into an institution, uh, or me.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's true. But it's okay. It's okay to start simple. It's
Yeah, well,
okay.
yeah.
It's okay.
But I mean, one of the things I've been focusing on when I'm doing, particularly with taxation, is not having the slopes of the supply curve and the demand curve be equal.
Sure. And I
So
think
you,
that that's important.
because otherwise you get 50-50 incidents, and that's misleading.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I just, you got to walk before you can run.
Mm-hmm.
I like to start there and actually show them as a almost like a barometer. Look, they're only equal right now. The suppliers and the demanders, they're only equally sharing the incidents because I cooked the books, because I
Mm-hmm.
made them equal, because I made the elasticities the same and parallel, and but that's not the real world.
Yeah.
And so now let's just take a look at something more, a little more realistic.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
I really like the idea of using reference points that, Toronto real estate or what have you, that are like, right, okay, what do we think the demand curve looks like? What do we think the supply curve looks like?
well, and one of the things that I do, and I'm not bragging, but I know that this gets them, is that these are all topics that I discuss on the radio. So
Mm.
one of the things that I think I'm able to do with my students, and it's, again, it's kind of cooked into the books, but I'll tell them, listen, Saturday I'm going on the Roy Green show, and I have to talk about this. I have to talk about the elasticity of the housing market, but I'll be completely honest with you, I don't know the answer, but I think we can work it out. And so then they get really, and they're like, he's going to talk about this on the radio, and he wants me to do the math. Okay, they go, first of all, he's an idiot, but if he wants, and we kind of really create almost a community by doing that. And I asked them a couple
Mm.
times during the term to basically be my research assistants and say to them, listen, I just need help. I don't have a lot of time right now, and we can take class time to do it, but I need some numbers. And so here's the TREB numbers. Here's the numbers in car sales. Here's the numbers in exports and imports. I need some net exports figures. And so,
Oh, nice.
it's not easy to do with elasticity, but it's doable. You just need some
Mm.
sense and some decent data. Even frankly, if you make up the data yourself, but you just
Oh,
say,
yeah.
you can lie. You just tell them that this is the data that I got from a particular good. And I figured since we're doing elasticity today, you'd help me work it out.
No, I really like that setup because it makes it real, and it's really inclusive in a neat way, which I think is super important.
And as I repeat, by the way, I'm not sorry to interrupt, but as we
No,
talked
no.
about last time, I also can cook in that I make the goods relevant to them. I
Hmm.
choose VCRs. I choose goods that the students care about, the students
Hmm.
purchase. And sometimes, again, if I know that I have a lot of students from a particular part of the world, I make it their good. And
Yeah,
they take a little bit of an ownership over that good. I make sure not to be, Eric Kam when I was 20 years old and talk about the market for, VCRs and DVD players because they've never seen either.
that's right. And it's amazing how many of these goods, just that used to be standard reference points, are just gone.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, by the way, I'll tell you another little thing I do. I tell a lot of stories about my family, and some of them are true and some of them are not. This one's actually true. When I talk about elasticity, I talk about how my grandfather was in the potato business. And I'll never forget this because I was about 16, 17 years old. I'd never heard of elasticity at this point. But I remember my grandfather, and we'd go and deliver potatoes to restaurants for my summer job. And he'd say to me, the only hard part of this job, Eric, I mean, I have a grade 6 education, so it can't be that hard if I can do it. The hardest part is figuring out who I can charge what prices. Who can I charge the higher prices, and who do I have to charge the lower prices? And I tell my students almost emotionally, my Zadie was talking about elasticity of demand. And I didn't know it. And he didn't know it. He just knew that some people you could charge a really high price and some people you couldn't. And that's how relevant this is. And that's how persuasive this topic is
Hmm.
to the real world. My grandfather needed to at least understand that there was a difference in the way you treat consumers and producers.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, that's so important. And that's a great story because somebody arriving at it intuitively and naturally, I mean, that it shows that it's doable. And I think a lot of there's a tendency to want to pretend that we're running around in lab coats when we aren't.
I tell my students, don't ever, and I know we're a little bit off topic now, but I tell them
Yes.
this is why there's so much to learn from whatever part-time jobs you have.
Mm.
I delivered potatoes on my back into restaurants. And you'd probably think, what's to learn from that? I don't know if anything's taught me more about prices and quantities demanded, quantities supplied, consumer surplus. These were
Mm.
things I didn't know the terms, but I knew that they were my grandfather's concerns.
Yeah.
And,
And
and he didn't know the terms. And if I told him the terms, he'd have said, what are you talking about?
who
But
cares? Yeah.
these were elasticity was the biggest challenge in his 50-year career. Who can I charge more? Who can I charge less?
No, that's a great example. And I think it's so important to show just because we stick a fancy label on it doesn't mean the concept is any different.
I think that one of the themes of my course is just because we stick a fancy topic, a fancy title on it, doesn't mean that it's not absolutely relevant to day, everyday life. And all of you, I tell them, all of you, whatever your part-time job is, somebody had to think about pricing those commodities.
Yeah. And that pricing decision, I mean, I'm going to be talking, I hope soon to somebody about price discrimination, because that is such a neat topic to get into it. But unfortunately, it's one of the ones that gets left off a lot of the time.
It does. I always try to squeeze it in because it's fun
Mm-hmm.
to have students fighting about why they should pay. Why shouldn't they pay the same to sit in the grays as they do in the good seats at a Leaf game?
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're at a natural sort of stopping point. So I'll give you the last word. What advice would you give to somebody who's struggling to get the concept of elasticity across to students and to have that fundamental success in delivering this particular topic?
Explain it to a 10-year-old. I mean, in all seriousness, I think that this is one of those times. I don't want to. I'm not naming names, and I'm not criticizing our colleagues, but sometimes I've done hundreds of teaching inspections, and sometimes our colleagues all over the board approach elasticity with almost an arrogance or a hubris, like
Mm.
this is hard. Watch me
Oh,
tackle.
okay.
And I think that they forget that they were probably sitting there in first year economics once also going, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
So I would really ask those people to go slow and to real and I don't think you can be too repetitive. It's one of the areas
Mm.
that I tell people don't rush. I don't care if you have to explain the formula 5 times. I don't care if you have to do the whole topic 5 times. I mean, you can't do it 5 times, but you know what I mean. I would tell people don't assume they get it. And when you say you get it, and they're looking at you going, I get it, they don't get it.
No.
They don't get it. They don't get it the first time. Trust me, they don't. So just tell them. You can even make a joke and say, I'm glad you get it because I'm confused, and we're going to do it again. And really take it apart slowly with the math. Put the pictures beside it with the graphs,
Mm-hmm.
and always have that duality so they can calculate it and they can see it. And then I think is then their brains can link up that when an elasticity is really high, the curve is really flat.
Yeah.
And then you can then say to them, that's right, because look at that flat curve. Itty bitty price change, massive quantity demand change. So the number's going to be really huge. And that brings up the last thing I want to say. Don't ever assume they're not going to flip the formula, because they're going to flip it. More times than not, they're going to, because I give them practice problems and they go, how come this didn't work? And I go, you have it upside down. And they go, oh, cool. What is the inverse of elasticity? And I go, nothing. Nothing. It is the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. I understand almost this weird desire to do price first, but don't, because you're calculating nothing. So, I mean, it almost sounds repetitive, and I think this is my answer for every time you're going to say to me, how do you approach it for young scholars, is slowly assume nothing. And, again, try to put yourself into that seat when you first heard it. And you were probably, I don't care who you are, you were probably a little bit confused, especially when you got into the total revenue. And because I think it is hard. I think it is hard. So just don't make many assumptions about how they're getting it. They can tell you they get it because they want to leave. Lots of practice problems, lots of my lab, Because doing economics really is learning economics. And so, some combination of patience and lots of practice problems.
It's great advice. My guest today has been Eric Kam of Toronto Metropolitan University. This has been Talking About Teaching Economics.